Hey, everybody. Before this week's show gets going, I want to take just a minute and talk with you guys a little bit about a new endeavor I've started here at the Podcast Digest. Something called Patreon. Many of you are probably familiar. Some of you, I know, have your own Patreon campaigns out there, other podcasters. Maybe you're an artist or creator in some other way. It's a new idea on a way that I can try to take the show to the next level. Those longtime listeners know that I also have a day job. I'm also a mobile DJ, got a family. And for me to be able to do some of the things I want to do with the show, whether it be add additional segments, maybe increase the frequency, I'm going to need more time. Well, time is one of the hardest things, right? How do you find more time? Well, in my calendar, there really isn't much. So to do that, I'm going to have to cut back on something else. But the bills still need to be paid, so to speak. So after 80 episodes of not taking advertising, not asking for anything other than, hey, here's a t-shirt, I've decided to open a Patreon. A lot of shows have done this very successfully, and I'm hoping that mine might be added to that list someday. But to do that, I'm going to need you guys to check out a link. That link's in the show notes for Patreon. It's a setup where I've got certain goals. I sort of spell out exactly some of the things I'd like to do with the show, some of the additional segments or frequencies that I mentioned. But there's also something in it for you as well. Oftentimes, I am approached here at the Podcast Digest asking for my help in getting the word out about other shows or maybe other blogs or what have you. And unfortunately, I'm releasing one show a week. I really can only do so much. There's only a show a week that I can potentially feature. But I want to be able to do more. I want to be able to push the word out there for great folks doing great work. That was why I started this whole thing. And as some of the rewards, I'll be giving out thank yous and shout outs and links and Twitter promotion and all kinds of things to help you get your word out as well. So take a look. You don't have to, of course. There's nothing's changing with the show. The show will remain free as always, weekly as always. But if you do like me or this show and you like what we're doing here, I'd really appreciate it if you guys just check out the link, maybe share the show. And of course, one of the best ways remains a review in iTunes or Stitcher or the upcoming Google Play. If there is, a place where you can say a good word about the show, that too is greatly appreciated as well. So I wanted to mention first, before even mentioning this on the podcast, I put this out on social media, and there were three gentlemen who took the leap with me and have already supported the show on Patreon. And I wanted to make a special mention of them here as the rewards note that I will. And that is Dana from How Is This Movie, a previous interview on the show and a great podcast producer. Sean from No Totally, they recently hit their 100th episode, and they are a great movie and culture commentary podcast, I will call it. So check out them as well. And Roger from The Kitchen Counter, another longtime friend of the show, who has jumped in there with their support too. So Dana, Roger, Sean, thank you guys very much for supporting the Podcast Digest. And folks, thank you for hearing this message out and considering this opportunity. And in the meantime, let's get on to our main interview. It's a great one. I hope that you guys enjoy, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is Dan Lizette, and this is episode 80, which sounds like a big number, doesn't it? Well, I guess it's sort of a big number, but it is nothing at all compared to my guest this week, as you guys have seen from the title of the episode. The primary host, if you will, co-host, co-founder, what have you, of the Cell Phone Junkie, Mickey Papillon, is my guest. Mickey, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me, and I alluded to it right off the bat, and it has to be said, 500 and, well, I guess probably 6 episodes at the time folks are listening to this. The Cell Phone Junkies have been around, and actually, I've been wanting to talk to you for a very long time because I've been a huge fan of the show that you and Joey put out there each and every week, and it was actually my very first recommendation here on the Podcast Digest back on September 1st, 2014, episode 1 for me. I recommended the Cell Phone Junkie, so it's a great honor to talk to you, Mickey.
Well, absolutely, and I do remember that show. I listened to it, of course, and was extremely appreciative of you guys covering the podcast. And yeah, 506 shows. It's unbelievable that it's gone on that long. And for those that can add up the number of weeks in a year and figure out what that division looks like, we are almost up to our 10-year anniversary. Jeez. So it's a pretty exciting thing for us.
That's an awesome thing. That is amazing. And a lot of my audience, Mickey, as you may know, are a lot of other podcasters. And there's a lot of people out there sitting, somewhere in a position like me, maybe 50, 60, 80 episodes in, or maybe they're 10 episodes in, or maybe they're just thinking about starting a show. And to see what you've done with the Cell Phone Junkie in terms of almost 10 years is so impressive. And we're going to talk a lot about it. But before we do, I kind of want to talk a little bit about you. Before the Cell Phone Junkie, before those 10 years, can we talk a little bit about how this kind of love and infatuation of mobile technology came to be before the podcast?
Yeah, of course. Who doesn't love to talk about themselves, right?
Right.
So my thing has always been, technology and specifically radios. I've always been a radio nerd. I have my ham radio license. I had CB radios growing up. For those of you that remember CB radios, scanners, all of that kind of thing. And so what really kind of tickled me about it was the communication aspect of it, being able to talk to people at great distances. And at the time, that meant a mile or two. And then, of course, when the advent of the cell phone came about, that was obviously a very interesting thing. And so as it kind of evolved, and my first phone was the Motorola MicroTac, which was the first flip phone that came out. This was back in, I think it was 1996 is when I got that phone. And so I got this phone and it was kind of just, love it at first use, I guess. But, that was at a time when batteries lasted 4 hours and, talk time was measured in dollars and not minutes or data. And so it was a very interesting time. And so I spent a lot of time just kind of tinkering and researching and just having a lot of fun with phones. And over, I'll just say, the course of the next, that would have been, I guess, 10 years, I got into some more two-way radio type of stuff. I did some radio sales for a while, and it also perpetuated the fact that this was when online forums were coming about and all that, and was able to participate in a couple of very specific ones related to the industry, including Howard Forums and Wireless Advisor. And I always went by the handle. I was at the time living in Arizona, and so my online handle was AZ Cell Phone Junkie, and it just kind of stuck. So 2006 rolls around, and I just was trying to, as I'm kind of going through life and learning, how things are working and hearing my first podcasts and all that, I finally decided, I wanted to figure out what the best podcasts about cell phones were out there. And guess what? There weren't any. And so I decided that, hey, you know what? I can probably figure this out. I can figure out how to do it. And so 505 shows ago, I posted myself, my first podcast, and it was as awkward as all of our first podcasts are, where you're really just reading a script and you don't really know what you should and shouldn't be doing. I did have music at the time. A lot of people don't have music on their first shows or even their current shows. But either way, that was kind of how it all began, and that's the history. And of course, then the name. I said, well, I need to call it something, and how about I'll call it the Cell Phone Junkie, because that sounds better than AZ Cell Phone Junkie because it's so specific. So that's kind of how it was born.
Isn't it crazy how you start out so early? I mean, you talk about scripts, and on the first episode of my show, when I talked about the Cell Phone Junkie, that's exactly what it was. And for those first 6 or 8 episodes, I was writing 3 to 4 page scripts that I spent, my 12 to 15 minute episode, and I basically read it back. That was my first 6 to 8 episodes. And now for talking to you, Mickey, because I've had you in my ears literally for years, and I'm such a technology junkie, and this is no disrespect to you whatsoever, I literally have no notes. just because I know your show so well. I feel like I know you from listening to you for so many years, and that's a long way from episode 1. And how has your show in terms of kind of preparation changed? Because one of the things with Cell Phone Junkie, anybody who's not familiar with it, one, you're crazy. If you're into technology, it needs to be on your playlist, is that your show is so information dense. What is the preparation process for you like?
Well, it is absolutely, and so we still use very extensive notes to put together the show, and so essentially what I do is I have a news feed that incorporates somewhere around 75 different tech news sources, and so from those sources, I essentially put together what the highlights for the week are, and of course, very specifically, figure out what is going to be, I'll just say, the most interesting things. And this is kind of how the show has changed over time, I guess, is we used to talk about just about everything that was happening every single week, and that was very difficult from a not only a time perspective but a planning perspective, because I wasn't, I would say, bubbling up the best things and the stuff that I thought was going to be the most relevant. It was just like whatever was out there. And so I still do prepare quite a bit for the show, and I put together, like I said, very extensive notes. If you haven't heard the show, essentially I like to call us the nightly news of the mobile phone industry. And so if you want to know literally what's happening in the news for the industry, and this includes, you'll hear kind of the structure of how the show notes look from my explanation here, but essentially you take and we talk about general things to start it off, then talk about each of the carriers and whatever news is out there at each of the different carriers, so AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, and then anyone else. Then we pop into device news and we talk about Apple, if there's anything going on the Windows Phone side, which are few and far between these days, Android, and then anything else that happens to be coming out there. But mostly it's Apple and Android stuff these days. And then we switch over to software and we talk about the latest iOS software, Android, other software, and then OS updates that have come out. So there's a lot of updates that come out. And we don't talk about every update for every single phone because that would be just insanity, but we talk about the big ones, right? So Verizon this week has announced that multiple HTC phones are getting the Android 6.0 Marshmallow update. And so that's starting to get pushed out. And so we will absolutely be talking about that this week. And then we go into questions and comments, and we have got people that either write into us or leave us voicemails. And we get all of those on the show as well, because I think it's really important to have that community aspect to understand what our listeners are thinking about, what they want to know, and how we can help them. And it's not just about the news part of it. So it's kind of the two phases. It's the news, and then it moves into questions and comments, and generally it's about 2/3, 1/3 of the time, but it all depends on the week. This week is kind of, we'll just call it the calm before the storm. We've got Mobile World Congress coming up in Barcelona starting this weekend, so that's going to be an incredible amount of device news that's going to be coming out of that. And so the process for me, though, goes through essentially putting together notes, and then Joey and I share them, and he will add stuff to them as well as he sees stuff and we see fit that makes the most sense for us and to be talking about. I go through and I put a lot of stuff down, and then I delete a lot of stuff, and I try and make it so that it's as balanced as possible. And ultimately, we then use these notes to put together the show, and we do that every Sunday. Just happens to work out. Joey is my best friend. I've known him for almost 20 years, I suppose, at this point. And so he lives in Minneapolis. I'm now out in the Washington, D.C. area. But, as we know with podcasts, you can be anywhere and do them. And that's what's so great about it. My prep goes through Evernote at this point. I used to use Google Drive exclusively for notes, but I've kind of transitioned all of my notes stuff over to Evernote, and I use the heck out of it. I've got almost 10,000 notes at this point. And so, it's very extensive. And so incorporating in the notes for the Cell Phone Junkie into there just made all the sense in the world. And of course you can share them. And so we have a shared notebook. And so that's what we use. And that's so I stare a lot at Evernote as I'm typing stuff in there.
I just wish I could change the color. The green becomes overwhelming after a while, I think.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, I mean, it's one of those programs, though, that I feel like is so good at doing whatever it is that you want it to do that I can't leave it. I know a lot of people with the changes that have happened in the operating systems, over time, with Mac and the notes being a lot more, a lot more feature rich at this point, they said, well, I can just export everything out of Evernote and start using that. No way it would work for me. I mean, everything is, like I said, so ingrained in this program, whether it's, snapshots of receipts or invoices or whatever it is. I use it for everything. I love it.
I can appreciate it. I too Evernote Premium for years, and I've parsed out some of it into notes, and but the big important stuff, especially the archival type stuff, like you mentioned, receipts, scanned documents, so on and so forth, all lives in Evernote for me. But you mentioned Joey, and I want to make sure that your co-host gets his due here. If I understand some of the history, your recent 500 episode, I heard a little bit more of the history than I was familiar with because unlike many shows, I mean, maybe out of a curiosity phase or a time capsule element, I imagine most listeners that find the show kind of pick it up in the stream. They don't necessarily go back to episode 1 and listen all the way through. It's oftentimes picking it up and kind of running with the ball from there. I know that's what I did. I think I found you guys somewhere in the 200s, and I've been a regular listener ever since. And I think Joey's been around for almost all that time or longer, but Joey wasn't on episode 1, was he? What was the story of him kind of joining?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of morphed, like I mentioned, at the episode 1 for me was just me talking. In fact, it was probably like that for episode 2 or 3, maybe even through 5. And then I realized I needed to talk to somebody other than myself. It just, when you think about what it means to have, if you're doing anything else other than really just narrative, you need somebody else to bounce it off of. And so I had a couple of guest hosts on pre-Joey. In fact, most people probably had never heard a show pre-Joey. But I had a guy named Jerry on, and Jerry is someone that I knew through online forums, and I had talked with him a few times, and so he joined me for a couple of shows. And then I had a co-host that was with me for a few months. His name was Matt, and he was there for probably episodes 10 through somewhere in the 30s. And it was in the 30s that there was a week that Matt couldn't make it or something had happened. And so I ended up asking Joey to join me. And again, so keeping in mind that I've known Joey for years at this point. And he and I, and it was interesting because he and I had always talked about phones. I met him, he was living across the hall from me. In an apartment complex, and he had his door open, and he had his big desk right inside the door, and a computer with multiple monitors, and this is the 90s, and so that was kind of like a very interesting thing. And so I got to talking with him, and of course, one thing led to another. We're big technology fans, and we started talking about phones and all of that, and so he and I immediately hit it off. And so when I had an opening one time, I said, "Hey Joey, do you want to join me on this podcast thing that I'm doing and be a part of it?" And he's like, "I don't know." And I convinced him to join me, and I don't remember the exact kind of the way that it worked out, but I do remember he was not real comfortable on that first episode with me, but it was, what happened was it was very apparent that Joey was really the perfect co-host for me, and that he and I kind of have this ongoing dialogue, as we all do with a lot of our friends, over messaging, and whether it's email or texts or whatever, Joey and I communicate just about every single day in some form or another. Photo stream is another way. We send each other pictures and stuff like that. So we're constantly talking about different things, and a lot of it surrounded technology, and so just like I said, it made a lot of sense, and it was great for us to be able to then dedicate that time every week. My wife calls it my therapy, because I get to jump on the podcast and talk to my best friend Joey every week, and it just works out really well for us. So it's a lot of fun to be able to do that. And so so Joey's been around for 400 and some odd episodes. The other interesting thing about the show, I didn't mention this as I was talking about the history, but so we did the show for just 3 years, something like that, and it was it started out 2 times a week, and that was very apparent very quickly. It was not sustainable, so we dropped it down to once a week. But then I was picking up momentum and starting to really enjoy it, and said, you know what, I wonder if I could actually model this to a premium subscription. But what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to take the show itself that was news based and say, okay, you've got to pay for this content at this point. So we started something that I called TCPJ Unlocked, and that was a show that was essentially like an unlocked phone. It was free of restrictions, and you could you didn't know what we were going to be talking about that week. If there was a big event that was happening that week, we would cover it in an incredible amount of detail. We would go through various topics in depth, whether it was the different technologies that were out there, to what was going on in the prepaid industry. We talked to a phone technician at one point, someone that worked for one of the carriers, and that was on the technical side. So we talked about all these different things, and we had a pretty good subscription base for that going, and did that for 4 years or something, like maybe even more than that. Maybe it was 5 years, and ran up about another 140 episodes on that show. And before it finally became too much, I had relocated, and so I had a new job. I was in a new state. I had a young son at home at the time, and so it was just too much. And so we backed off of that show. We sunsetted that thing, and that essentially moved on and said, we're just going to do the single show every week. It's the funnest, most enjoyable hobby that I have, being able to talk about the stuff that I love. And so I did not want to give up on that. And I love talking to Joey every week as well. And so there were just all these things that kind of played into coming up with what the format has been essentially for the last 3 years. And we really haven't changed a whole lot since early 2013. So it has gone as you hear it today for the last 3 years. And before that, it was tweaked a little bit, but essentially we do what we do, and it works out pretty well. And we've got a pretty large listener base that checks us out every single week, and certainly appreciate you listening to the show as well. Love to hear that people are listening to it and they like it, because that's why we do it.
Yeah, when you talk about Unlocked and you throw that into the equation, you're dealing with approximately 650 episodes at this point. That is a phenomenal amount of hours spent recording that probably exceeds just about anyone I've spoken to. Jason Snell may be close in terms of my previous guests with all of his multiple shows. He probably gets close to that total as well. But that is just an amazing back catalog. And it's funny, I was going to ask you sort of what keeps you going, but what might be even a more interesting question is, what keeps both you and Joey going together all this time? I mean, obviously you mentioned enjoyable hobby component, and that's for sure. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I think a lot of us are kind of into this game, but I think we've gone beyond that as sort of the main reasoning when you're talking 650 episodes. What is it is it the listener interaction? Is it just the tabs on the industry? Is it talking to Joey? Is it all of it? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I could say, it's any of those things, but it's one of those things. I'm a very disciplined person, in many respects. I have kind of that, I've got to have that structure. I've got that almost addictive type of personality that just thrives on that kind of thing. And so it's almost like I don't want to let the listeners down more than anything, because we've been doing this for so long that I don't know what we would do. I don't know what I would do on Sundays if I wasn't recording the show. And so, I guess what keeps us going, it's an hour a week, really, for us to get on, and it's like any other phone call to us. It's just a way for us to have a conversation. And that's the beauty of this whole thing, is that when you find that person that is a true, partner with you on something like this, it's not just he's my show co-host. He is a guy that we would be having these conversations pretty much regardless of whether or not the record button was pressed or not. And so it just is a way to kind of to finish up the weekend for both of us, I guess, and to be able to talk about the stuff that we really enjoy. And so he and I, like I said, we lived in Phoenix together for a while, but he had been gone. I have not lived in the same state with him for probably almost 15 years at this point. And so it's rare that we actually get to see each other, except we get to see each other every single week on the podcast as we do this video call. And so it's fun though, in a situation like, I think it was 4 shows ago, something like that, 501, 502, somewhere in there. I happen to be in Minneapolis. That's where he is. I'm originally from there. That was another, one of those things like, okay, commonality, common interests, common, backgrounds and all that. And so I was in Minneapolis and happened to, of course, carve out time, and we recorded together, which are my absolute favorite ways to do this, because it is like being in a radio studio with somebody. And unfortunately, it's not as common as I would like it to be, but. I don't know what else to say. I mean, other than it's just the kind of the hobby aspect of it. I mean, why do any of us do any hobbies? Because it's relaxing. It keeps me sane. It gives me something to do and to look at other than work on the computer. And plus I need an excuse to buy new phones and new computers and new gadgets and stuff like that. And so this is the perfect way to justify it to myself, I guess.
And I do want to get in a little bit of kind of the personal tech stories here in just a second, but I wanted to cover one other thing under this kind of endurance concept. Lest anyone listening who's not familiar with you or Joey or the Cell Phone Junkie over the years, I want to make it clear that one of the things, I imagine, that's not been keeping you guys going is this lavish lifestyle and riches that have come from hundreds and hundreds of episodes. Right. I know you mentioned you dabbled a little bit with sponsors, and you mentioned the premium service from Unlocked, but those have never really been the focus of the show. It's always been more about sort of the content and the partnership with Joey and kind of that hobby aspect. This has not necessarily been a windfall situation for you gentlemen, correct?
No, definitely not. I think we were thousandaires at our peak, but we never hit 5 digits. So it really was something to cover costs of what it was that we were doing. And it's the sponsorship thing is interesting. It can be, you can make a little bit of money here or there. I did YouTube videos on some things for a while, banner ads on the website and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it never really made its way, to a point where I felt like, yeah, this could be, a permanent job, something that I'm going to do, day in and day out. But it was more just how do we figure out a way to cover some of the costs. And that had to do with, we would travel, we would go to the industry trade shows. Most of the folks that are there are actually working for a website that is ad supported or supported by some other, something else that's providing the funding for them, whether it's an online store or something like that, which is great. And that it's great that they can do that. But in order to, you've got the airfare to these things and the hotels and the food and all of that. And so it was like stuff like that I just was looking to have a little bit of an offset of that cost. And so that's why we started to do those different things. But the premium show, when we decided to start doing that, that was kind of an attempt to say, okay, we do pretty decent content. And I think if we take just a little bit more time to focus on that, to put together a little bit more structure around individual topics, release 2 shows a month, I think we can get $5 for that. I think that makes sense. And if someone wants to sign up for a longer period of time, yeah, we'll give them a break. You can, get, I think it was like 3 months for $12 or something like that. I don't remember exactly what the structure was, but again, it wasn't a lot of money. And, but we had listenership in the hundreds, which I thought was pretty decent. You talk about some of the bigger podcasts out there, they're getting, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of downloads. But those are people that are just, throwing it in a podcatcher and grabbing the shows and that's, they're listening to it. But as soon as there's a money exchanging hands, then there's a pretty big commitment there. So, but I had done the show for a couple of years. It's not like we started out asking for money for it. It was, right. This is what we do. And here's what this new show is going to be about. Check it out if you want. If you don't like it, we'll give you your money back. I've got no problem with that, but I think you'll enjoy it. And over time, it was that listenership grew, and I got a lot of feedback from people when we stopped the show, and they were bummed out because they loved it and they loved being able to support what we did. But again, that was a really stressful thing because people were giving us money, their hard-earned money to do the show, and there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. Right now, it's like, well, you're getting what you pay for with our show today, and I can't say anything other than we over the years we certainly appreciate every single download of every single show. and every person that's heard us talk about things, because it's just these simple these quick emails that we get from people that will thank us for something, or we helped them out with something. We've heard from forensic detectives that have used the content and the things that we've talked about in the show to help them do their jobs better because they understood a little bit more about one thing or another. And I that's the kind of stuff that I really find just interesting, that it's not just an entertainment, although I think about it a lot of times, it's just an entertainment function, but it's a way for people to learn, to stay on top of what's going on with the industry, and that's a lot of the reason why I do it as well. But to really just overall to do good stuff, and that's kind of why I keep doing it as well, I guess.
One of the things that I've noticed over time, Mickey, that I'm kind of curious if this was a conscious decision or just something that sort of happened naturally and you guys kind of fall into, or maybe I'm just completely crazy, but it seems that over the last couple of years especially, that on the Cell Phone Junkie, there's a lot more you and Joey personal stories, personal experiences with your own devices, your own service. You're famously in the midst of kind of a 6-month periodic check-in with your experience of T-Mobile right now. It seems like that is somewhat of a newer kind of highlight than maybe a couple years back. Am I right about that? And if so, is that sort of a conscious decision? Because I find those to kind of be the most valuable information.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly why we do it. I mean, there's always, and we generally talk about it at the top of the show, and we just like to start it off with stuff that makes us, be more than just, talking about, the news, which, I mean, you can go out and read the news or you can listen to the news, whatever. But it's, I guess, when we transitioned away from the Unlock show, it's amazing I'm bringing this up for the third time, but when we transitioned away from that show, there was no real place for us to talk about those type of experiential things that we had in our lives, and that was a lot of that fit into the to the Unlock show, and so we had to find a place to put that. And the other part of it is, our lives are busy, and so a lot of that is Joey will say, "Hey, I want to talk about this," or I'll say, "All right, I'm going to talk about this thing," and he's never heard any of the story, or neither have I. And so it's almost like, well, let's have that conversation and let's record it because it's going to be interesting. And I'm going to probably have some questions. You're going to have some questions. And so it is a conscious thing that we try and do. And I also think it starts out the show a little bit better. And I do, yes, to the dismay, and I've heard this from some people, have talked a lot, disproportionately so, about T-Mobile recently. And really because I wanted to put my money where my mouth was, because we had been talking about them forever as this like kind of like come from behind story of a company that is like doing all these different things. And I was in a situation where, so I've got this thing I call my 90% rule, which is if your phone works at your house and your primary place of business, which for many people is an office or at least one stationary location, if your phone works at both of those places and that commute in between, and it works without fail or without any issues, you're generally going to be happy with the cell service that you have. If you have an issue at your house or your office, or you can't use your phone on your commute, you're probably going to be unhappy or angry and think that is the worst carrier in the world. Yep. And so for me, I've bounced around from different carriers. I still have multiple lines, but I've pared it back quite a bit. And I had Verizon when I moved to the Washington area. Now, again, Verizon is the local landline incumbent company. They're the ones that provide all the the POTS lines, and they do the FiOS service and all of that. The basketball stadium, for crying out loud, is the Verizon Center here, and so they've got a big presence here. And wouldn't you know, the service that I had in my office, on my commute, and in the house that we bought was not good. So, I mean, it was like a triple whammy, and I said, all right, that's it. We've got to make a change. We've got to figure out something. And so we ended up, I said, look, let's just try T-Mobile. Let's see how they do. And so I had a prepaid SIM that I'd done some initial testing with, and said, okay, I think the service is gonna work out just fine. I don't see any potential real issues, and it's been fantastic, and I've had a lot of fun being able to use it. And by the way, it also saved a few bucks over Verizon, so that helped too.
Well, I'm just on standby, Mickey. I'm waiting for the full and complete answers to exactly how BingeOn works. I know you're still going through that process. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is so fascinating how they've done those different things. And I don't watch a lot of video. I don't find myself, or if I do, I'm on Wi-Fi, so I don't actually need that. Although I was on jury duty earlier in the month, and I was sitting there in the jury room, and of course they had Wi-Fi, and I'm like, whatever, I don't care, I'll just use my service. And then I was like, you know what, I'm going to watch some Netflix, and it turned into like 3.5 hours or 4 hours of Netflix or something like that. And it was like 3+ gigabytes of data, and not a speck of it was on the data plan. And
I think I was referring to, maybe more I'm referring to the music stream, because you've been going back and forth.
Oh.
This counted and that didn't count, and I don't know how that counted. And it's just, I can tell you're just about to just like bang your head against the wall with that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what was going on. I do actually think my account had some issues that appear to have been resolved. That's the Music Freedom is what they call that program. But yeah, no, it seems to be working pretty well. When you listen to music on your phone, it does use some data, but it's not the actual music, it's the album art and all of that. So I'm just schizophrenic when it comes to it. I'll pull up a station or something, and on a 1.5-mile drive, I'll listen to like 25 songs, because I'll listen to 3 seconds of each song and to try and find the song that I want. And with all of that, you're downloading, 100K of imagery for every single one of those songs. So you're going to pull down multiple megabytes of data as you're doing this on the imaging side, but none of the music counts. So I think that was part of what I was seeing. But then I also think I did have a problem with my account. But it seems to all be resolved, and so far so good on that.
Well, that's good, because that was a weekly soap opera for a little while, and I knew,
wasn't it? Yeah.
I knew each week there would be another update, and I hear you get going on it, and I'm like, oh boy. Something's going on here.
Yep.
Let's talk about your own technology use at this point. I know that you have been a part of various platforms and various devices, but now you are mostly an iOS guy, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, if you're talking about like what I have and use, I've got a 6S, which not the Plus, but the actual, just the S, and I have that one very specifically because when we switched over to T-Mobile, they have the new Band 12 support for LTE in that particular device for T-Mobile, which wasn't on the 6. I had a 6 on Verizon that I brought over and I used for a little bit. And it was okay, but I was having problems with it, and it was in a dramatic difference when I got the 6S. So I've got that device. So that's my primary phone. I mentioned having multiple lines. I'm not even sure why I brought that up, because I don't actually carry multiple lines. I have another line in my name, and I've got a family member using it, but that's it. And then I have an iPad Air that also has the cellular connection built in, and so that is also on T-Mobile because they give you a good bundle deal, right? And so, but it's not the Air 2. Joey's got the Air 2. I don't. I never saw the reason to upgrade. I still don't, because the new one will be out here very soon. And then I use a MacBook Pro as my main computer. So and I've got an Apple Watch. I mean, it's one of those things you start buying into this, and it's like, what am I going to do? Like I'm just kind of like down this road, and I don't feel like giving up on iMessage, and I don't feel like giving up on Apple Music, and I don't feel like really dealing with anything else. And so I'll just keep using it. And to my dismay, with every major operating system release, we seemingly have more and more bugs in iOS, which is very frustrating. I mean, I think it was iOS 8 when it first came out. Oh boy, was it, it was full of all sorts of issues. And, iOS 9 had its fair shake as well, and I'm sure iOS 10 will too. But as you continue to build on all of these features that they're putting in and all of these different services and all of that, it's just kind of one of those things that happens. And so whenever I'm talking to somebody about this and they find out what I do at the show, and they say, "Oh, well, you're using an iPhone, so I'm using an iPhone, so I must be good." And I said, "Well, do you like it?" And it's always, yeah, it works fine. I said, "You don't have to ask anybody, for help with it, right?" And they said, "No, I generally figure it out." And even these are not technically advanced people. Generally, you can. That's the beauty of, and it's not just the iPhone, but it's primarily the iPhone. And everyone that I've known that has had an iPhone and switched over to Android, that has not been in the technology world, has ultimately gone back to the iPhone just because it was simple and they didn't want to think about it. And so, and I'm at that kind of point in my life too, where I don't want to be thinking about this. I love Android and all the flexibility that it offers. I just don't really want to deal with it. I just want to use my phone. When I use my phone, and I love the ability to be able to do these like crazy things like talking on my watch. Like I actually do that. So and that to me is really interesting. Oh, and I talk on my iPad, and I talk on my on phone calls on my computer, and that to me is useful. And so having that, what they call continuity, is very valuable to me, and that's more valuable than having whatever flexibility someone would try and sell me on Android these days. So
I can completely agree, and in fact, my own tale sort of follows the exact same path. I was just sitting here thinking, if Joey ever needed a week off, I'll be happy to stand in for him, Mickey.
Love it.
I'm sitting here with, let's see here, I go Mac Mini, MacBook Pro, Apple Watch, 6S Plus, and iPad Pro. So that's my collection at this point. Very similar in terms of that interaction between devices. I mean, you can't beat it. And even if one out of that family of devices starts to get in your craw a little bit, the concept of replacing it with another OS and losing that interactivity, whether that be, the iCloud photo library or messages on any of the devices or calls on any of them, whatever it is, you just start to think, because I've done it. I've had the Android phone. My last one was the Note 3. I was on the Lumia 928 at one point to give that a try when it first came out. I've got an LG G Pad, I think it was the 8.0 when it first came out. Tried them all and have come back here and settled just for a lot of the same reasons that you've just talked about.
It's so interesting because you talk about having all these devices, and I've gone through so many of those like you have, and I don't know if it's just having moved across the country twice in the last 3 years, but I've kind of given up on anything that doesn't have a place in my life almost every single day. And so if I have a piece of technology that can be given to somebody else, whether it's a coworker, my brother-in-law gets a ton of my stuff, where I'll just give stuff away because I just don't want to deal with it, and I don't want to be thinking about it. And it's amazing what, at least, and this is me, and I don't know if this is like this for you too, but if you've got a piece of technology that has a particular function and you're not using it, it just drives you crazy. And it can be silly stuff, right? It can be like an external battery pack. Like, to me, if I've got too many external battery packs lying around where they don't have, a spot in my briefcase or a spot, on my desk where I'm rotating it through and I'm actually using it, I've got to get rid of it, because otherwise it's like mentally clouding my mind is like the one thing that I need to manage or to deal with. And I really just don't like that. So anyway, but yeah, that's really the extent of it as far as the technology that I'm using these days. And I do love the iPad. I use it a lot, but it's probably the single device that I would say I could not live without, and I could also easily give it away tomorrow, because it doesn't. It does all these great things, but it doesn't do anything that I absolutely have to have something like that to do. And so I could easily be a laptop and an iPhone guy, but however many years it is later, 6 years later, and I still keep buying them and using them, and just kill the battery just about every day. So that should tell you, about I basically have it on all day long, and I'm doing kind of secondary computing work on it all the time. So I do love it.
So with you pretty much firmly entrenched in the Apple camp at this point, and having a show like the Cell Phone Junkie that covers much, much more than just the Apple world, what I'm curious about, and I've had these conversations, recent guest Andy Anatko, I had this conversation with him. He famously, I believe in 2013, switched from Android to iPhone and had to deal with some angst out of all kinds of horrible people on the internet. I'm wondering, what has the feedback been? Have you ever had crazy people come and talk to you? Because technology fans, especially platform fanboys, if you were, can be insane. Have you had that type of experience with the Cell Phone Junkie?
Yeah, I mean, every once in a while, someone will say something, and really where it comes out is if there's a very specific question about something that is relating to something on Android, and I try and cobble together my experiences of using Android over the years, and it just absolutely doesn't relate to what's happening today. That's usually where I get in trouble. But generally, I don't know. I mean, people from time to time will give me a hard time about it, and it's too iOS, focused or whatever, and okay, fine. That's what we like, and that's what I prefer to talk about, because that's where my comfort level is. And by the way, this is also my show, and so I get to choose the content on it. So I like to, but again, I like to make sure that the stuff that we're putting out there obviously you're essentially got a 50-50 split with iOS and Android, and so we got to make sure that we're talking about the stuff, and the majority, I would say, of the news that we talk about comes out of the Android camp, just because it's not a single manufacturer. It's essentially half a dozen manufacturers, or in some cases a dozen, that are releasing devices that are of some sort of importance out there. And I think the other fascinating thing is to talk about what's happening in this changing world of, if you look at the top manufacturers that are out there today, obviously Samsung, LG, people know Motorola, but they're not in the top 5 anymore. I think they're like number 6 or something. You've got Huawei that's coming up, and you've got all these other brands that have just gone on fire, and it all has to do with the fact that they can support open Android, and they're very popular in other parts of the world where you've got incredible numbers of people buying these things. The emerging markets are just absolutely fascinating, and so we try and cover that kind of stuff too. So it's not just it's not just a show talking about the iPhone 6s and the Galaxy S6. Although if we did talk about that, we would cover 90% of the devices that our listeners are using, but that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide something that's a little bit more broad-reaching than that.
And there's so many interesting things out there. I mean, and I know I feel like I don't have a technology show, but I feel like I should, because I am very similar. A junkie. How about that? I featured you guys in my first episode. I have a lot of those same subscriptions. And I saw the one, speaking of like the crazy things happening in the marketplace. What is this over in India? There is now an Android handset out, or coming out today, for that costs less than $4. Well, did you see that today?
Yeah, but here's the thing with something like that. That absolutely, and you talk about like, well, how good can it be? Well, how good does it have to be is really the question, right? Because if you're talking about somebody where $4 is I'll say it, a day or maybe even a week's salary for that person,
right?
That's a big purchase. So think about what that means in terms of your dollars, and kind of do that correlation. And so that's where this industry is going, and how it's going to see the expansion. We made the transition starting in, call it 2007, when the iPhone came out, to the smartphone world, and BlackBerry has come and gone, and Windows Mobile has come and gone. Windows Phone is almost gone, and we've now solidified ourselves with that. They call it the Mac versus PC of the mobile world. But so like the overall computing platform has kind of spread, the mobile platform is going to do that, but probably like 5-fold, because that is absolutely can be the primary computer for somebody. So I want to bring up something that I read, and this was really interesting to me this week, and I've never really thought about this, and I'm sure other people have, but if you think about all the devices that you have, the one that you probably touch the most out of any device, and really almost anything in your life, is your phone. And so if you take that mindset and you figure out how you would minimize your life down to just the bare essentials, and you travel and you need to have a computing device when you travel, what is the problem with leaving the laptop at home, leaving the iPad at home, and just taking your phone and one other piece of equipment? And that other piece of equipment is a Bluetooth keyboard. And I when I first saw this headline, I kind of rolled my eyes and went, okay, fine. And then I started reading it, and I started thinking about it, and I thought, I may actually consider trying that. And where my thinking was, for the most part, I can get by using, my virtual keyboard on the phone just fine to do things. But when it comes to actually getting stuff done, I almost always want a keyboard to do it. And I will delay or procrastinate on an email or something that I need to do, because I just mentally have this block of wanting to type on glass. And now if I had a keyboard out there, it would be no big deal. So I grabbed a keyboard and I paired it with the phone. And so I've got this. I've got a day out tomorrow, and I whether or not this is going to actually be a topic for the show or not, I think it might. I'm gonna try it and see what happens, because I'm always the one who brings the iPad everywhere with me. I don't generally bring a laptop, but I bring the iPad everywhere with me, and it's not that much of a burden. But at the same time, I don't like to have a keyboard on it, and but I don't want to carry two things either. So, but where I'm going with this is this kind of idea of using a phone as your primary computing device makes all the sense in the world to somebody who's never had any technology. Yeah. And so if they can get a device for $4 that can access the internet, can communicate, can be a point of commerce, this is huge. This is life-changing for that particular individual. And so I don't remember who the company was that released it.
I don't remember either.
I think absolutely this thing is got merit to it, and overall, just because it's a Freedom 21 is the smartphone that costs $4, and it's not a looker, but it's going to get it's
going to get the job done.
Yeah.
Just like you were saying. And I think that I was talking, again, I'll reference my conversation with Andy Anatko, and him and I talked about, or I brought up to him because I think he's one of the few tech pundits, if you will, tech reviewers, tech commentators that regularly features cost as an important talking point on all the shows he appears or articles he writes for Chicago Sun-Times. And that's not done all that often. Oftentimes you hear about these very expensive, we're both Apple users. Apple devices aren't cheap, and we, eat that cost to use them. But there are millions, hundreds of millions of people who will never be able to afford that. And for those people, should they be shut out, or should they have something that's viable? And that type of the Freedom 21 phone, or what a lot of these other manufacturers are doing as well, whether it's, the Moto G or any of these other low-end phones, quote unquote low-end, it could be a huge step up to somebody who's never had a laptop or tablet or computer. And this is like, Facebook, and it can completely change their world. So
yeah, and before you get a preconceived notion about like what a $4 phone looks like, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking like a Nokia phone, right? I mean, you're thinking like all this thing can
it's a smartphone.
It's a smart. This is a this is basically the iPhone 5. It's a 4-inch QHD display. It's got a 1.3 gigahertz processor, a gig of RAM, and 8 gigs of internal storage. It has front and rear cameras. The rear is 3 megapixel. Think about what the original iPhone had, and a 1400 milliamp hour battery, and Android 5. This is no slouch. I mean,
those have been decent specs about 4 years ago.
Yeah,
or so.
Absolutely. And so, and again, to someone who is just getting this device, and it's being sold by a company called Ringing Bells, which is interesting. But it's 251 rupees. Is all this thing costs, which is $3.60. So.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You hear a lot of conversations on a lot of tech podcasts. If you listen to a lot of them like I do, and you're immersed in the world as well, they keep talking about that eventually the cost of technology goes to zero. Regardless of what that technology is, eventually all those technologies go to zero. There are talks now, Apple, but the infamous Gene Munster talking about what's after the iPhone, and by 2028 or whatever, they expect the iPhone to be gone, and they're going to replace it with some mixed, augmented reality headset or whatever the case may be. Like the cost of technology just keep going down and down and down. Eventually tablets will be paper thin, and so on and so forth. And you can almost see that future when you see a $3.72 smartphone.
Absolutely, you can. And I think it probably is the case where if you look at communication devices as we know them today, and you see what the iPad is and how that kind of world is blending. I mean, obviously the biggest thing is going to be to figure out how to incorporate better types of communication, and do it in a way that you don't have to have this thing that you're holding up to your head, right? I mean, there's got to be a better way to do this, and there'll be some breakthrough that's gonna show us how to do it, and I think it'll be interesting to see then how the iPad is. Kind of slides into our lives, and it'll probably take more prominent place. And so I keep rejecting the larger screen sizes, though. I mean, I still, again, the reason I don't have the Plus model of the device is I look for something that is something I can still use relatively easily with one hand, and we're right on the verge of that at this point, and I probably just need to deal with it and figure out how to use something bigger, but darn it, I don't want to yet. So
I remember that first 5-inch phone, and I remember thinking, gosh, this is huge. This 5 inches.
Yeah.
It's interesting how far we've come. I saw Amazon Fire HD6 went on sale today, one day only. This is about 10 days before you guys are hearing this, and it was $70, and it's a 6-inch tablet. And I'm thinking to myself, that could also probably be a phone at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing, isn't it? I mean, there are the iPhone is 5.5, so I mean, it's
you're talking about your keyboard experiment. I seem to recall when the Plus, the 6 Plus, not the 6S Plus, came out in 14, that there were some people doing that, actually trying to use it as an iPad mini replacement with the Bluetooth keyboard. And that the Microsoft one that's well reviewed right now, that folds in half. You could literally take that, stick that in your back pocket with your phone, take it out, work in a coffee shop, good to go.
Yep, absolutely. And the only issue that I see with this whole idea is that at the end of the day, you're still not getting probably that screen real estate that you're hoping for, and so that is probably going to be the barrier to the making this thing actually work. But I love the idea. The only other downside to this is, of course, carrying the iPad with you saves your phone's battery, and so that could potentially be a problem. And I generally don't really have issues with the battery on the iPhone. I run into it if I am streaming a lot of music or something like that, but I'm still over 50%, and it's 10 o'clock at night, so this thing has been off the charger for 15, 16 hours, something like that. So I don't generally have battery concerns. I know some people do, and I guess if I were to use the phone more, I may feel a little bit differently or have a different tune there.
Well, you can always get the pretty Apple battery case as well,
I could, but I won't.
Well, no matter where all this technology goes, Mickey, I have a feeling the Cell Phone Junkie, or possibly in some rebranded name, as we move further and further, maybe as cell phones start to get replaced by something else. Something tells me you and Joey are going to be there every Sunday to talk about it. Am I right?
I think that will be the case. As long as we are physically able to do it, I think we will continue. I really don't see any reason not to at this point. I mean, it's that much fun, and our listeners keep us going, and we love to hear from people. We love to hear, the ideas that people have, the stories that people have, and if we can help somebody and answer a question, then that keeps us going for another month. I mean, it's really like that kind of motivation to keep bringing people the best information that we possibly can.
So anything you can let folks know maybe on the horizon for the next 100 episodes or so? Are we going to see any type of changes, anything new, any interviews, traveling, anything, device reviews, anything you guys are tinkering with, might be throwing out there you could preview for us?
Boy, I wish I had something. I mean, we are a fine-tuned machine at this point. I from a perspective of just getting it very quickly into the kind of the nuts and bolts of how we do the show. I mean, we both record locally, Joey and I do, and he sends me his track, I mix them together and do post-processing, editing and all of that, and we get the show out from start recording and posting, and everything is up. I'm probably 90 minutes. I mean, it is like cooking along. We don't mess around with the timing of it. We're both, like I said, both very busy, and we try and make sure that we do spend time, with our families and whatnot. And so that is that is kind of the goal with this thing. So as far as what's going to change or what's going to come to the show, I don't know. Unless we can make it any more efficient, I don't see us doing anything too dramatic for sure.
Well, whatever it is or isn't, it can continue along in its current form, and I will keep listening as I have for any number of years now. Like I said, it was 200 some, I'm guessing. I mean, when I first found you guys, it's not as if I made a mental note of the first episode I ever heard, but I'm speculating it's somewhere around that time. I've been a big fan for a long time, Mickey, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me here to talk about it.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for having me. Always fun to join other podcasts, and certainly thank you for the opportunity.
Can you take just a minute, tell folks where they can find the Cell Phone Junkie, where they can find you on Twitter, all the stuff? Yeah,
so the show is over at thecellphonejunkie.com. And it's essentially a weekly show. The site itself is a placeholder for the podcast. So it's pretty simple. You go on there and you can click on each of the shows. There's a download the show directly link, and you can just listen to it right there from the website. If you don't want to throw it in your podcatcher, just listen to it straight from there. If you want to catch us on Twitter, you can. The show itself is Cell Phone Junkie because there's too many characters in the Cell Phone Junkie. So Cell Phone Junkie is the show. Essentially, though, just a placeholder for posting of new episodes. I am at Mickey Papillon, which is MICKEYPAPILLON. And you can follow me on there, which I'm not overly active, but I do respond to at replies and whatnot. So would it be, would love to hear from you. If you have anything you want to ask us or ask me, do so on Twitter. That's probably the best way.
Cool. And I will make sure all of those links are in the show notes as always, folks. And if you're listening to me in the Podcast Digest, I'm going to assume, if you've been along with me for the ride, that you've got at least a passing or mild interest in technology based on the wonderful roster of guests I've been lucky to talk to. If you're not familiar with the Cell Phone Junkie, one, that's shocking given how many episodes they're in. But if you are just now hearing about it and you do enjoy technology, go check out the Cell Phone Junkie and the work that Mickey and Joey are doing. It's a wonderful show, chock full of information, and I love the way you put that, Mickey, the nightly news for everything that's happening in the mobile tech industry. I think that's a great summary. Maybe 60 minutes. I'll go with 60 minutes because it's weekly.
There you go.
Right? So there you go. So, Mickey, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
And folks, that'll do it for this week on the Podcast Digest. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette, and I will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.